Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Daf Yirav continues the Gemara's discussion about what was done with leftover hektish money and other hektish items. The Gemara continues its discussion about the shkalim, and then the Gemara goes on to other items mentioned in the Mishnah. The Gemara will quote a machlokes on the subject. Then we get to the next Mishnah, which discusses ketores, leftover ketores, how it was brought to a state of chulin to be able to be used for an additional year, because the ketores was reused, leftovers were reused from year to year. So first of all, the Gemara has said in the Mishnah that there was a ramp built to carry the parah aduma to the Har HaZeisim where its avodah was performed. The Gemara said that each Kohen Gadol built his own ramp from his own money. So the Gemara criticizes the Kohanim Gedolim for this at first. The Gemara says that there was a shachatz in the part of the Kohanim Gedolim for doing this. There was a pride, a unnecessary boastfulness, and they each wanted to have their own ramp, and they didn't want to have a ramp that was used by any other Kohanim Gedolim, so they went ahead and they spent up to 60 talents of gold, 60 kikar zav, in order to build this fancy ramp of their own. And they didn't hold over the ramp of the one that was built before them, and they wanted to have their own. They wanted to be called their own parduma on their own name. So the Gemara says, how could you say that? The Gemara says, we know that Shimon HaTzadik made 2 paradumas in his lifetime, and for both of them he built a new ramp. Now even if you want to say that Shimon HaTzadik had bad midos, which is impossible to say, it wouldn't make sense to say that he didn't want to use his own previous ramp because of some sort of gaiva issue that he had. It was his own ramp, so why did he have to build a new ramp for the second one? So the Gemara says that the reason that they built it in their own ramp, the reason that they built a new ramp for each paraduma had nothing to do with the gaiva. It was because they wanted to show the high level of tahara that has to apply to a paraduma. They wanted to show a high level of respect and treated with a special reverence, and therefore they built a new ramp for each paraduma. The Gemara says, similar to that, we see that the ramps had walls blocking the view of the people walking on the ramp, or blocking their view from things outside in order to prevent tumah from happening. Either we wanted them to not look out over the side of the ramp lest they lean over the side and become tummy from something that they're leaning over, or we didn't want people to see them and then rush up and touch them and create a tumah situation. Next, the Gemara moves on to refer to a machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael as to whether you're allowed to do business with things which belong to hektish, whether hektish is allowed to do a business deal. Rabbi Akiva had said it is forbidden. You're not allowed to take flour, oil, and wine that hektish owns and sell them for a profit. And Rabbi Yishmael said that you are allowed to. So the Gemara explains what Rabbi Akiva's opinion is. Rabbi Akiva said you're not allowed to do that, not for hektish, also not for money which was collected for the poor, because you may come to a loss, and we don't want to have a loss for hektish. So the Gemara says Rabbi Akiva would agree that if you're willing to absorb the loss yourself, then you are allowed to do business for hektish. Hektish is allowed to invest and sell at a profit, as long as they're guaranteed not to lose, because whoever is doing it is going to take the loss if there ends up being a loss. The Gemara brings a similar incident. The Gemara says that Rav Chia Bar Ada had money for the poor in his possession, and he asked the Shaila if he's allowed to do business with it, and the Gemara said that you are allowed to, and he went ahead and he did, on the condition that he was willing to take the loss. The Gemara says that Bar Zmina also had money with him, and he asked Rabbi Mona, and he said you are allowed to do a business with it if you take the loss. Okay, now later the Mishnah had mentioned that there was something called the money that was left over from the fruits and the money left over from the nesachim. So what are these things? What are the fruits and what are the nesachim? So the Gemara says that it's a machlokes. Rav Chia Bar Yosef says that the leftover from the fruits means the money that was earned from the sale of hektish. And this is Rabbi Yishmael, in accordance with his own opinion. Rabbi Yishmael says you're allowed to sell the wine, flour, and oil for hektish, and the funds of the fruits was the money you earned with that. Now, what's left over in nesachim? That's where you get money in the following way. The hektish would contract with people to sell them the supplies, the flour, the oil, and the wine at a fixed price throughout the year. If the price went down, that means hektish was given more, because the amount that they paid now bought more than the price was when they made the deal. So the rule with Hektish was that Hektish always wins. So if the price went up, Hektish didn't have to pay more. If the price went down, Hektish got more stuff based on the lower price at the time of delivery. So that more stuff that they got, what do they do with it? So that was called the fund of Nesachim. Alright, this is all the opinion of Rabbi Chia bar Yosef. The Gemara says Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. Rabbi Yochanan says that the leftover fruits is that extra stuff that they got if the price went down. Leftover Nesachim, that means that when they filled up the kli to make the carbon mincha, they heaped over the top. They had a heaping amount, both of dry ingredients, where you have a heaping amount, and of wet ingredients, where you could actually have the liquid go over the surface of the kli itself because of surface tension. Either way, you have a heaping amount. That heaping amount was flattened out, and it wasn't used. So the extra that was pushed off the side, that was the fund called the extra of Nesachim. So Gemara says, what does Rav Chia bar Yosef hold about that heaping stuff? So Gemara says, that heaping stuff, that goes in the same fund as the extra that they got if the price of Nesachim went down. He also agrees that goes in together. Okay, so now the Gemara says that the Mishnah seems to support the opinion of Rav Chia bar Yosef, and the Gemara explains why. We had seen that the Mishnah says that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Chanina did not agree with Rabbi Yishmael about the use of the fruits. Now, if you want to say that Rabbi Yishmael's extra fruits refers to the money that they made from the sale, so now we understand why they didn't agree. They didn't agree because they held you're not allowed to sell. However, if what Rabbi Yishmael was referring to was the extra money they got if the price went down, so the extra materials that they got if the price went down, so why would they not agree? They should agree with it 100%. So Gemara says, no, they agreed that there was money from there and there was a fund from there. They just didn't agree with Rabbi Shmuel as to what you do with it. Rabbi Shmuel said that it was used for kites and mizbech. It was used for when there are extra kamanas that you bring when the mizbech is empty. They said, no, the fund exists. They didn't use it for kites and mizbech. They used it for klei sharis, to use it to buy extra kelim, tools to be used in the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, the Gemara discusses more deeply the topic of the heaping amount which went on the top of the klei sharis. So the Gemara says this heaping amount was from a carbon mincha. Now, carbon mincha didn't have to be a public carbon. There are private carbonos mincha. So if the fund was fed by all these extra heaping amounts that are on the carbon mincha, some of it is privately owned. That means if you're going to take the money from privately owned carbon mincha and you can put it in this fund and you can use that fund to buy klei sharis, it comes out that the klei sharis is bought with private funds. That's not allowed. Klei sharis have to belong to the public. So Gemara says it's okay because we're going with the opinion that you are allowed to have a private person donate something for public funds. We assume he gives it wholeheartedly, and just like Big Day Kahuna could be made by somebody privately and given to the public funds, these keeping amounts from the carbon menachas could also be given to the public funds as long as it was given wholeheartedly. Now the Gemara says as well that there is a differentiation between the heaping amounts that are liquid and the heaping amounts that are dry. Dry ingredients, whatever is heaping on top of the kli was never in the kli in the first place, and therefore it doesn't really have kedusha. The kedusha applies to the flour when it's put in the kli. If it was always heaped on top, it was never put in the kli. Now, liquid amounts is different because it's poured in all at once. You don't say that the part that's in at the top, the part which heaps over the top, is the last part that was added. It's not what happens. You pour in and it pushes up what was in the kli before, it gets pushed up to the top. Therefore, whatever's on the top, the heaping amount in a liquid, that was in the kli at some point, and therefore was niskadish by being in the kli. So, do we say that this heaping amount belongs to Hektish both in dry ingredients and in wet ingredients, or only in liquid ingredients where it was in the kli, not in dry ingredients where it was never in the kli? So Gemara says that it doesn't quite have the kedusha. The Gemara proves, but it does belong to Hektish. The Gemara proves that it belongs to Hektish because we have a brayso that says they could both be used for kites and mizbech, the fund for kites and mizbech, and therefore they do belong to Hektish, even though they don't have the kedusha of being put in the klei sharis. Okay, we're now beginning the next Mishnah, which discusses what happens with leftover ketoris. What happened was as follows: there was a storehouse of spices that were used to burn every day for the ketoris service. Those spices were made each year, and they added up to enough spices for 368 days of usage. Now, a year is only 354 days, so they had an extra 14 days or 15 days of usage depending on the year. If there was a leap year, they used up some of it, but they had extra from year to year, and they used it up for the following years. Now, the question that the Mishnah is bothered by is as follows. The Ketoris is bought with money from the Machzis Shekel that we've seen. The Machzis Shekel is changed every year. You can't use last year's money for next year's Machzis Shekel. So how could you use last year's Ketoris for this year's Ketoris? We know that the Ketoris storehouse rolled over from year to year, but it can't. It's last year's. So the Gemara says you have to change its Kedusha from last year's Machzis Shekel Kedusha to this year's Machzis Shekel Kedusha. And the Mishnah discusses how you did that. So the Mishnah says what they did was they took the Ketoris that was left over at the end of the year, and they transferred its Kedusha to money that was set aside to pay the Beis HaMikdash's workers. There were people who worked for the Beis HaMikdash. They did construction or other things that they made throughout the year. They had to be paid. The money that was set aside for them, the Kedusha of the Ketoris was transferred onto that. The Kedusha was now Chulin. The Ketoris was now Chulin. This Ketoris was given to these workers. They now owned it. It was their payment. That was their wages instead of the money. And then Hektish took new money from the new Machatzis Shekel fund for next year, if there was any. Otherwise, they used last year's because they had to use it anyway for the Karbanos. But they took new money, and they now paid the workers with the new money, transferring the Kedusha from the new Machatzis Shekel onto the Ketoris, which was Chulin beforehand. So now the Ketoris has the Kedusha of the new Machatzis Shekel, and that's how it got new Kedusha. So Gemara asks right away, what do you mean? The money that you set aside to pay the workers was Kedusha also. That was Bedek Abayis money. That also had Kedusha. You can't transfer the Kedusha of the Ketoris onto something that has Kedusha already. It may not be the same Kedusha, but you can't transfer Kedusha onto it. So Gemara says, you're right. They had to take that money, and they had to transfer the Kedusha off that money first. What did they do? The workers often brought supplies with them. They brought bricks, they brought mortar, whatever it is. Those supplies were Chulin. So and when they became part of the Beis HaMikdash, they were fitting for Kedusha. So we would take the money set aside to pay them. We would transfer the Kedusha off that money onto the bricks. Now the money was Chulin. Then we would take the Ketoris and transfer the Kedusha from the Ketoris onto that Chulin money. And then we would complete the process by having the next year's Shkalim transfer Kedusha onto that Ketoris. The Gemara now asks, okay, but what did they do with the money? Meaning they had that money, now had the Kedusha of last year's Machzis Shekel on it. And they transferred the Kedusha from the Ketores onto that money that they had made Chulin. But now that money has Kedusha's Machzis Shekel of last year on it. What are you going to do with that? Gemara says they used it to pay off the workers who made the Ketores and the Lechem Hapanim. There were two families that were expert. Beis Avtinis was expert at making the Ketores with a special ingredient that made the smoke go straight up. And there was a different family called Beis Garamu, and they were able to make the Lechem Hapanim in the square shape that it shouldn't collapse. So they had to get paid specially. They were workers who worked on these things, the Lechem Hapanim and the Ketores. They were befitting to be paid from the Machzis Shekel, so we still owed them money from last year's work, so we paid them with last year's Machzis Shekel. So Gemara says, okay, what if they didn't know their money for last year's work? You can't pay them with last year's Machzis Shekel for next year's work. So Gemara says they use it for Kayetz HaMizbech, they use it to bring Karbanos, they use the money like you do with every extra Machzis Shekel, you use it to buy Karbanos, to bring in Ola when the Mizbech is empty, and you don't want it to be empty, so you bring these Karbanos. So now that last question was asked and answered by Rabbi Chia Barba. The Gemara says, why did he ask it if he knew the answer? The Gemara says, no, he wasn't sure whether or not it could also be used for Klei Shores, to buy Kalim, to use in the Beis HaMikdash. He knew it could be used for Kayetz HaMizbech. He was asking if it could also be used for Klei Shores or not. And the reason he had a suffix whether or not it could be used for Kayetz HaMizbech was he had a suffix whether or not Ketores, the reason he had a suffix whether or not it could be used for Klei Shores is he had a suffix for whether or not Ketores needed Klei Shores to be Mekadesh. If Klei Shores if Ketores required Klei Shores to be Mekadesh, then it would have the same Kedusha as Klei Shores, and he could use its leftover, the money that got the Kedusha from last year's Ketores, could be used to buy Klei Shores because it has Klei Shores Kedusha in the first place. But if you didn't need Klei Shores to be Mekadesh, then it was a different Kedusha, you wouldn't be able to use it to buy Klei Shores. And the Gemara says this is actually a machlokes between Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who says it does not need Klei Shores, and Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina, who says that it does require Klei Shores. Now, the Gemara goes into this machlokes a little deeper. What's the reasoning behind this machlokes? Gemara says that the pasuk says Kodeshi According to Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Chanina Kodesh, he tells you that you should be mekadesh the ketores in the kli shares. According to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, no, Kodesh used to teach you something else, that the money comes from machzis hashekel, that you should buy ketores with machzis hashekel, money that was taken in the Trumas Halishka. It's got nothing to do with the fact that it needs kli shares. Now the Gemara says that this machlokes is also machlokes between Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan. Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan also argue about the subject whether or not ketores requires kli shares or not. The Gemara shows each opinion. The Gemara first shows Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says that Kitaros does not have to be Kaddish B'Kli Sharis. Where does he say that? So the Gemara quotes a Mishnah, which we're going to see coming up, that says that where somebody was Makdish all his property, he said, all my property should be Hekdish, and they look at his property and they find something there that could be Karban Tzibor, what do you do with it? The Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan says, what property could he possibly own that could be Karban Tzibor? It's got to be Kitoros. So you see, Rabbi Yochanan holds that Kitoros could be something that you own yourself and didn't have Kedusha of the Kli Sharis. Now Rabbi Shai says this does not necessarily show that Rabbi Yochanan holds that Klisha, or that this Mishnah holds that Kitoris did not need Kedusha in Klisharis. It could be it's referring to Kitoris, which was Kaddish in Klisharis. How did it become somebody's private possessions then? Simple. It was given to him as wages. He was one of the workers that got it as his wages. Like we said, that the Kedusha was transferred onto money, and then the Ketoros was given to the worker as their salary. So maybe that's how he got hold of it. But really, it did have Kedusha from Kli Sharis in the first place. Now, where is Shmuel's opinion? So the Gemara shows that Shmuel says in a statement, he says that the grinder that they used to make the Ketores had a status of Kli Sharis. So you see, Shmuel holds that Ketores has to be made with Kli Sharis. So Gemara now asks, what do you mean? If it has Kedusha, it has to be made with Kli Sharis, it's Kachim, how could it be redeemed? We in our Mishnah said that you transfer its Kedusha onto money. Well, how can you do that? You can't redeem something which is Kachim. So how could you say that Shmuel holds that it has Kedushas Kli Sharis? So Gemara says, no, something which is extra, which is left over from Korban, from usage for the Tzibor, that as a special halacha which Shmuel holds that is allowed to have its Kedusha transferred onto something else, you could redeem it. And the Gemara says we're going to show you this is actually Shmuel's opinion, and a different machlokes is between Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan. But what you do with leftover sheep that were set aside to be a carbon ola, to be part of the carbon tamid, you have leftover at the end of the year. What do you do with it? Shmuel says you could redeem it. It's leftover public karbanos, even though it's kachim, you're allowed to redeem it, just like you're allowed to do with the ketoros. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. Rabbi Yochanan says no, you have to wait till it gets a mum. Only once it gets a mum, it loses its status of kachim because it can't go in the mizbeach. Then you could redeem it, and that's always the halacha with any kachim that you're not going to use. You have to wait till it gets a mum. So now the Gemara says, okay, we saw this machlokes between Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan about the carbon ola that's not being used because it's extra. What about extra karbanos chatas? You had a collection of seirim, goats, to be used for carbon chatas. What if you have leftovers for that? So the Gemara says, according to Shmuel's opinion, that you're allowed to redeem the carbon ola, you're certainly allowed to redeem the carbon chatas. Why is that? Because the money that's going to be left, the usage of the karbanos, if you redeem it, goes for carbon ola. Use the money for carbon olas for kayetz hamizbeach. So if we allow you to redeem it in order to prevent the carbon ola from going to be used as karbanos ola, so certainly to prevent the carbon chatas from turning into an ola, that we allow you to redeem it and transfer its kedusha onto money. That's for sure. The question is, what about according to Rabbi Yochanan, that you're not allowed to redeem karbanos ola, are you allowed to redeem karbanos chatas? And the Gemara says it's a machlokes. According to Zeira, you have to let them graze until they get a mum, and then you could redeem it and use the money for kayetz hamizbeach. When Shmuel bar Yitzchak, you could actually use them directly for the mizbeach. You don't have to wait until they get a mum. You could turn it into a carbon ola and use directly the mizbeach. So Gemara says, what do you mean? I could turn a carbon chatas into a carbon ola? What's the Shmuel bar Yitzchak saying? How could you, Shmuel bar Yitzchak, how could you turn a carbon chatas into a carbon ola? Set aside as a carbon chatas. The Gemara says, no, Karbanos Tzibor didn't get their name Chatas Ola until you actually brought them. Till Shechita, you didn't define it as a Chatas or an Ola. We knew what we were planning to use it for, but it wasn't set aside to be one or the other. Mark gives another answer. When Beis Din made it in the first place, they set it aside. They did set it aside to be a Karban Ola, but that was all tonight that it would be needed. If it turned out that it wouldn't be needed, then that designation did not apply.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.